on showing solidarity with anti-racism. I invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on the Minister to speak to and move the motion. Minister, 13 minutes.
Let me start with three vital words that everyone needs to hear and we all need to understand. Black lives matter. All across the world, people are standing up and making that point. Cross-party consensus on this point is vital, and we will be supporting the amendments brought forward by the Labour Party and the Green Party to the Government's motion today. I know that all of us across this chamber have been shocked and appalled by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis on the 25th of May. His terrible, senseless death is a tragedy that has reopened the seismic fault lines that exist within US society, where for too long black people have continued to suffer the most appalling inequality, prejudice and discrimination. Large parts of America are standing up and saying, "Not in my name," and enough is enough. Now, Presiding Officer, I know it is absolutely understandable that people should wish to make their voice heard. At the weekend, we saw protests across Scottish cities, which included many thousands of people coming together to show their anger and solidarity. I now want to turn to the inequality that black and other ethnic minority communities in Scotland continue to experience. When I undertook a tour of Glasgow last year, not for the first time, but to learn more about the cities linked to the historic slave trade, I was struck by just how much that terrible stain upon our history is still woven throughout the fabric of that great city. Whilst today we are resolutely focused on improving the lives of black and minority ethnic people, we cannot forget that we once enabled the terrible practice of slavery. It is clear to me that roots of the entrenched structural racism that continues to pervade global society are firmly based in the historic enslavement of black people, mainly from African countries. Racism has allowed white people to determine black people as a subhuman class, treated as chattel, as property. By reducing black people to this status, it salved the collective conscience of white people over the world to justify their barbaric acts, and we should all take responsibility. But to be frank and absolutely honest, we have not gone far enough, and we need to make much greater progress. In 2017, we published a Race Equality Action Plan outlining actions we will take over the course of this Parliament to secure better outcomes for minority ethnic communities in Scotland. Scotland is a place where people are healthier, happier and treated with respect, and where opportunities, wealth and, more importantly, power are spread more equally. Our race equality framework aims to ensure that this vision is achieved equally for people of all ethnicities, helping to build a Scotland where we all share a common sense of purpose and belonging. Presiding Officer, as I draw to a close, I want to re-emphasise that last point. The inequality that black and other minority ethnic people continue to experience, be it health-related, hate crime, economic or societal, continues to be unacceptable and is a fundamental issue of the failure to realise the human rights of everyone in Scotland. It can and it must change, and I am committed to doing everything I can to help change it. I am sure that the whole Parliament surely can unite behind that ambition. Thank you.
Making that happen, we are all anti-racists, and we must stand up together and say so. Among the line of buses and cars at the front of the church, Savant Moore shared the sentiment that he posted on Facebook in the aftermath of the killing. It really took a global pandemic with no sport, no concerts, no vacations to get the world to sit down and have no choice but to watch what's really happening to black people in America with zero distractions. The killing of George Floyd at the hands of the police has galvanised particularly young people to say enough is enough when it comes to the treatment of black people at the hands of the police in America. But it has also drawn attention to the wider inequalities and structural racism faced by BME people all over the world and here in Scotland. Scotland is not exceptional when it comes to racism.
In Glasgow, whether we choose to rename streets or indeed the area we still euphemistically call the Merchant City, we could be instituting new memorials, lasting, visible, permanent structures to remind people of the history. This is not about tearing down or erasing history. This is about finally, truthfully telling history.
To the brilliance in their field, pioneers through achievement. That message is so important to me. Nelson Mandela said, and I quote, "Sports have the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire, the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language that they understand. Sport can create hope where there was once only despair. It is more powerful than governments in breaking down racial barriers, and it laughs in the face of all types of discrimination.
There are few times in human history when something captured on film is so incendiary that you immediately recognise it for the defining moment it is set to become. The sight of George Floyd choking out the words, "I can't breathe," under the knee of a white police officer shortly before he died was one such moment. Last week, Donald Trump sent in the National Guard to crush the activities of protesters with tear gas and with rubber bullets. Taking on to Twitter, Trump warned those protesting in their tens of thousands in dozens of cities across America, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Aside from violating Twitter's incitement to violence rules, that phrase also resonates with America's racist past. Remember, presiding officer, this is a president who describes white supremacists as very fine people. For all the nightmares that 2020 has thrown against humanity, I hope that the coming US election should give us hope for lasting change. But
my opportunity today was not to say that Black Lives Matter, but to make Black Lives Matter. And that starts at home. No blacks, no Irish, no dogs has been replaced by no fats, no femmes, no Asians. Racist signs replaced by racist memes.
I've talked about the horror in watching the footage coming out of the US recently, and there are almost no words to describe what was the slow murder of George Floyd, an African-American man, at the hands of a white policeman in broad daylight, and even more chillingly, watched on passively by a number of his white colleagues. Surely we have to continually challenge whether the anti-racist activities, the values that we say that we hold to, are actually affecting progress in society, and the evidence seems to be that it's not. So what does that mean, that self-examination? It means that every one of us has to have the courage to face up to Scotland's colonial history and to take substantive action to dismantle the structural inequalities that have followed. Almost 100 years, one-third of colonial governors were Scottish, that Scotland sent disproportionately large numbers to fight British colonial wars. Now, it's also worth mentioning, and we have to mention those that can inspire us, and of course the list is long. It's Martin Luther King, whether it's Stephen Biko, Nelson Mandela. Well, I'd like to finish, presiding officer, with a reference to somebody in my constituency.
And thinking about this debate today, unless I feel uncomfortable saying the words and members feel uncomfortable hearing the words, we actually won't be telling it like it is. It shouldn't take events on the other side of the world for racism to be a mainstream issue in Scotland or the United Kingdom. George Floyd happened 2 weeks ago. Sk8er Boi happened 5 years ago. And we shouldn't think that this is an isolation. There is a global phenomenon where there are politicians who will seek to use nationalism and populism to other minorities in order to gain power, democratic power and economic power. And I also say to people, it's far too easy for us to think that this is about Donald Trump. Racism didn't start with Donald Trump. It won't end with Donald Trump. Trump is a symptom. He is not the cause. And I also say to people of all political parties and every member across this chamber, it's easy to take the knee and tweet and post about Black Lives Matter when it's trending on Twitter. It's easy to say the words when the whole world is talking about the issue, but it's actually what we do that matters. So to every single leader of every single political party, to every leader of every institution and every organisation, thank you for your solidarity. It matters, it's important, but we will fundamentally judge you on the action you take and the decisions you make. Every chief executive of every council and every government department, white. Every director of a department in Scotland, white. Every principal of a college or university in Scotland, white. Every head teacher in Scotland, white. Every chair of a public sector body in Scotland, white. Every High Court judge in Scotland, white. Every prison governor in Scotland, white. Every editor of a news organisation in Scotland, white. Why? Is it because we don't have the talent? Is it because we don't have the ability? Or is it because that the opportunity doesn't exist? Or worse yet, is it because people don't think they're wanted or they're not welcome? That's what we should be fundamentally addressing. And we talk about this Parliament chamber. In the entire history of Scotland, we have only elected 3 BME MPs to Westminster, 2 from one family. In this Parliament in 20 years, we have only ever elected 4 BME representatives, all 4 from Glasgow, all from a Pakistani background, and all Muslim. Not a single from a different gender or a different race. And quite often, to be blunt, it's been despite their political parties, not because of their political parties.
So it's a privilege to be able to speak in this important debate today. And that's a phrase we hear often. But today, I'm also a bit ashamed of that privilege. The international outcry and protest following the murder of George Floyd at the hand in Scotland, who told us their lived experiences of racism here in our communities. It was harrowing, it was disappointing and hard to hear, because it meant that I have failed that community. We all have. And it's by not doing enough to tackle racism, to take that action that Anna Sarwar was talking about. For me, the most shocking revelation was that the casual name-calling, the street abuse, the actions that were described by Brian Whittle so passionately earlier on, that overt, easily recognising racism was to be expected. I found that chilling. But what caused most harm and frustration to those on that call was the systemic institutional racism, the racism born of privilege and unconscious bias that hurt them the most. More than one family had had to change the school that their children attended because they saw a lack of understanding and support when their children were subjected to racial abuse. Appalling behaviour in itself, but the failure of the schools and the education authorities to address this adequately was devastating for these families.
A direct line through history from the forced abduction and deportation of black Africans for sale and slavery through to the myriad of injustices faced daily by black and minority ethnic people in Western culture today, whether that's in Scotland, America, Australia, or anywhere else. I've watched as campaigners have toppled statues, and I've listened as professors have argued that instead of tearing down, you should add context instead. And in truth, I feel ill-equipped to enter parts of this debate. How can I, not just white, but with properly Celtic skin, know what it is like to be the only black face in a room? I can't, and I don't. Yes, I've been abused and othered for being a different type of minority, but I've never had that minority status be the first thing that people notice on first meeting me. I've never had people look at my name on a CV and make an assumption about my ethnicity. And I've never been told to go home when I live 2 miles down the road. I don't have that lived experience, so I would rather listen to those who do and to their suggestions for what next, what practical and, if necessary, legislative changes will make things better, rather than charge in here in all my whiteness with some 10-point plan. To recognise that this isn't some binary issue, but one of immense complexity with hundreds of strands threading the globe down the years.
Presiding Officer, the police violence in the United States, evidenced most recently in the murder of George Floyd, is reprehensible. It's one sickening incident in a litany of violent horrors that we see across the Atlantic from our TVs. But anyone watching in horror from 4,000 miles away and thinking that Scotland is not racist, anyone thinking that our institutions and structures, that our Scottish society is fair and equal, would be wrong. International solidarity is important, it's crucial, but if we're really honest, it's also pretty easy. In welcoming this debate this afternoon, Clare state, racism will not end with passing motions in Parliament. Without long-term commitments to anti-racist actions and policies, we'll not be able to reduce and ultimately eradicate racism in Scotland.
Is that doing things in the establishment way, the polite way, doesn't take us any further forward. And what's driven this has been direct action on the streets that has driven this change. That's the lesson that we have to learn.
That engaging in empty gesturing about racism ends up being performative and a quiet way to continue systematic racism. Reflecting on their words and the words of Anna Sarwar, I say a hashtag, a picture taking the knee, are not the same as exacting meaningful, lasting change. And to quote Intercultural Youth Scotland directly, racism is not only valid or worth addressing when there's a worldwide focus on it, It's important that organisations consider their actions continuously, including evaluating their own positions before recent events, actions during it, and their plans for when the media focus dies down. This Parliament hasn't focused on race inequality enough, and we clearly see that we're not diverse. Secondly, though, because that's something that each and every one of us in this chamber here can change. No hiding, no excuses. We all have a direct influence over our own party's policies and internal workings. We can change things, and we can do that before the next election. I can't pass my mic to a black or minority ethnic sister in this Parliament because there's no one here, and that's not good enough.
Very mindful of the fact that I'm speaking as a white man, but let me share my reflections of what has happened over the last few days. In particular, our prison statistics show that you're twice as likely to be a prisoner if you're a person of an ethnic background. And while that's not necessarily true of Scotland, there are still issues we need to face. Why is it 5 years that we've been waiting for the inquiry into Sk8er Boi's tragic death? And why don't we have disaggregated data on hate crime? Because if we don't know who is suffering these injustices, what backgrounds they come from, how can we tackle them? That is the call that BMIS have made. It's the concept of institutional racism. That racism isn't just something that is perpetrated by people, it is perpetrated by organisations through their practice, through their culture. And it's perhaps that final point, that how we perpetrate and continue racism through culture, we need to reflect closely in Scotland. And I was because it's critical that people understand the legacy of slavery, the legacy of racism that surrounds us all, the wealth that it accumulated, and how that has perpetuated inequality and injustice in society, and Scotland in particular, today.
An awful long time. And if you don't know that you're doing something wrong in that period of time, there is something psychiatrically wrong with you. And that gentleman with his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck deserves to get every punishment that's possible for it. But the unfortunate thing is, it didn't come as a surprise to any of us in here, and it didn't come as a surprise to somebody of my age who can remember 1968, for example. Possibly the only good thing, there's nothing good came out of this, but the reaction to it was not 1968, and it could have been. 1968, the whole of America was burning because people had had enough, and it could have been. And that might be a glimmer of hope for how we move on. But just today, there's I just saw it today, there's a policeman in New Mexico who's been done for manslaughter for kneeling on somebody and saying, "I will choke you out." And so he did. The poor man died, and this police officer's been charged with manslaughter, which goes to show you just how prevalent this is. Some of the videos we've seen, I would have, if we'd seen them on the television and I know what goes on to some extent, I would have thought they were just exaggerating too much. People getting beat in the streets, cameras on them, they don't care, they just expected to get away with it because they've got away with it for so long. So it's good to see that social media has played a part in this, because they're not, we have our racists, we have people that just can't get beyond centuries ago. But he did say that he thinks that up here there's at least a will to change and a desire to change, which for me was very encouraging. Not everything he says to me last night was encouraging. You know, he's a good friend of mine, and it was pretty hard to hear some of the things that he was saying. But he sent me a video just after it. Somebody mentioned earlier on about how in the 70s it used to be so common to see some of the things, you know, some of the names that were called. And he sent me a video after it and he says, have a look. It was Love Thy Neighbour, and the episode was called The One with the Pakis. I mean, seriously. And I never looked at it, obviously. I mean, I looked at I never played it, but he says that's what we had to put up with all the time. Some of those statues, I don't want to see statues of people that don't deserve to be there lording over us. And I think that a museum might be the best place. In terms of the street names, a plaque as opposed to removal until such times as we have a whole look at Glasgow and see if, I'm talking about Glasgow here clearly, we have a whole look and see if you want to change names in the city. But you have to be very careful, because if you're going to take away a name that's been there for one reason or another, you have to be careful what you replace it with. You don't replace it with something that is newsworthy just now but might not be in 10 years' time or whatever, because you just then replace it at that name with another stage with something else. Make sure that there's a lot of thought going into this.
Inequality that still exists needs an honest reflection of history, but it also needs an honest reflection about the political ideas that are still current in our society today. The ongoing white supremacy, which is unchallenged far too often. And we've seen, for example, in this country, elected politicians briefly suspended and then happily reinstated despite provocatively racist comments that they've made in the past. Anna Sarwar's speech, I think, impressed everybody who heard it. He challenged all of us, an important challenge, that our words are not enough, actions are what counts. And I think that also was reflected in the letter to the First Minister that Ruth Maguire mentioned from the Coalition on Racial Equality and Rights. I think that letter has been copied to all parts.
Focus minds on an issue which is too often marginalised in Scotland, and it's important for us to demonstrate our support but also commit to action. We have had powerful speeches that reflect on our history, on how Scotland's cities and its wealth has been built, speeches that have highlighted the inequalities in our society and the need for us to take responsibility and challenge racism where it exists. We must not accept that all things stay the same, and we must redouble our efforts in Scotland and apply pressure around the world for change. We often pride ourselves on presenting Scotland as an open and welcoming place to live and work, and evidence can be found to support this. But that does result in us intentionally or otherwise downplaying or hiding the racism that does exist. In 2010, the Scottish public was asked if Scotland would lose its identity if more Black and Asian people moved here, and 45% of respondents said yes. Perhaps we are less open and welcoming than we like to think. Institutional racism and structural inequality exist in Scotland, and we need to recognise it, highlight it and commit to address it on a continuing basis. Diversity. We've only elected 4 MSPs from ethnic minority backgrounds. Not a single woman from an ethnic minority has been elected to this Parliament. Last year, the Commission for Racial Equality and Rights published an overview of race inequality in Holyrood, which showed a marked fall in how often race was discussed over the lifetime of this Parliament. This debate has been an opportunity to highlight how and where structural racism exists, but we need to see continuing action to address it. If we want to actually be an opening and welcoming place to live and work, we have to act, not just talk. And the letter today, which MSPs received from the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, sets out 5 achievable actions for Government and Parliament, which are now overdue. We must commit to delivery.
When we consider if the country and our institutions are racist, it doesn't mean every white person must be ashamed. It means that they have a duty to consider what it's like for others. It's very naive to say we're not racist ourselves and other places are worse, so there is no issue here. We've got to understand and come to terms with the fact that some people's experiences are so different to ours that their whole worldview is different. Black people are not treated the same in Scotland, Britain or America. Too often Black lives don't seem to matter as much as white lives. That's not only apparent in the extreme examples like the tragic case of George Floyd. It's clear when we see more Black people dying from coronavirus. It's clear in the employment gaps between races.
I'm angry that in 2020 we're once again confronted with scenes of horrific racial injustice. I'm angry that in 2020 we're still dealing with overt racism, with subtle racism, with institutional racism, with structural racism. Whichever form it takes, it is still racism. You may well think that as time has moved on, that racism has declined, that manifestations of overt racism are no longer commonplace. I'm afraid that's not the case, Presiding Officer. I don't have to cast my mind back particularly far. I suspect the same is true for Anas, to somebody calling me a paki. Don't even start me on my Twitter timeline, which is frankly a cesspit of racism. I'm angry, Presiding Officer, because in this day and age, we're still telling people of colour to go home. Brian Whittle, what I thought was a really excellent contribution, says that he remembers a time in a bygone era when he would see casual racism on the TV. He doesn't have to go back to a bygone era, presiding officer. I heard it just yesterday. I saw a video clip yesterday of the social commentator and author Afua Hirsch on a panel chaired by LBC's Nick Ferrari. She explained her views of needing to confront the racism of figures in British history. And Nick Ferrari's response was, if you don't like Britain, which is her home, why do you stay? He would simply not have asked that question if a white person was sitting in the chair. But people of colour are still fair game when it comes to racism. Forget the racial jibes. Forget the slurs that we still have to put up with. Racism is literally killing minorities, as we have all seen and we have all referenced. But as everybody has mentioned, racism doesn't just exist in the United States. The events in the United States force us to hold a mirror up to ourselves and to confront the racism that exists here. The unconscious, the subtle, the overt, the institutional, the structural. On all of these fronts, Scotland is not immune. Presiding officer, this is the part where we should all begin to feel uncomfortable, because we have to accept the reality and the evidence in front of us that Scotland has a problem of structural racism. As people have mentioned, take this Parliament as an example. Over 300 MSPs have come and gone out of this Parliament, our nation's Parliament, and in 20 years, not a single black member of the Scottish Parliament. Our shame. Not a single female woman of colour, to our shame. And the only 4 ethnic minority MSPs have all been Scots Asian males. And take Anas and I, we're hardly even diverse between us. Both male, both born and raised in Glasgow's South Side, both in our mid-30s, both went to the same private school, both middle class. Our fathers even come from the same region in Pakistan. His father happens to be the governor of that region. My dad didn't quite get there. The Conservatives, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, they've never had a single person of colour make up their ranks in 20 years of devolution. I don't say that to point the finger. I say that because you know we have to make change. They've never had a single MP from Scotland that has been non-white in their history. And to my colleagues on the government bench, we know that we are not immune either. Some people were surprised. They were taken aback even by the mention on my social media that 99% of the meetings I go to, I'm the only non-white person in the room. The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. The Lord Advocate, white. The Solicitor General, white. The Chief Constable, white. Every Deputy Chief Constable, white. Every Assistant Chief Constable, white. The head of the Law Society, white. The head of the Faculty of Advocates, white. Every prison governor, white. And not just justice. The Chief Medical Officer, white. The Chief Nursing Officer, white. The Chief Veterinary Officer, white. The Chief Social Work Advisor, white. Almost every trade union in this country headed by people who are white. In the Scottish Government, every Director General is white. Every chair of every public body is white. That is not good enough. I don't doubt that if I looked across the private sector, that black and minority ethnic people would similarly be underrepresented at senior levels. This is a collective failure on every single one of us, as they had a police officer's knee on their throat for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Here are George Floyd's last words. "It's my face, man. I didn't do nothing serious, man. Please, please, please. I can't breathe. Please, man. Please, somebody. Please, man. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Please. Man, I can't breathe. My face. Just get up. I can't breathe. Please. I can't breathe. Shit. I will. I can't move. Mama. Mama, I can't. My knee, my nuts, I'm through. I'm claustrophobic. My stomach hurt. My neck's hurt. Everything hurts. Some water or something, please, please. I can't breathe, officer. Don't kill me. They're going to kill me, man. Come on, man. I cannot breathe. I cannot breathe. They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me. I cannot breathe. I can't breathe. Please, sir. Please, sir. Please. I can't breathe. Presiding officer, I hope we're all angry. That should be our overriding emotion when confronted with racism. I hope that every single one of us takes that anger and we use it to recommit ourselves as anti-racist. Let us be judged by our deeds, presiding officer. Our deeds, not just our words. Thank you.
So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause.